The night Nia Okoro whispered to a stranger was the night her life stopped belonging to her. She didn't know that yet. She was standing in the middle of the most dangerous room she had ever walked into, dressed in a gold Ankara wrap dress, camera slung over her shoulder, smile fixed like armor, and every single person around her was lying about who they were. The invitation had called it a cultural exchange gala, .wea, a celebration of African and Korean art, commerce, and diplomacy. What it actually was, Nia had figured out 40 minutes ago, was a money laundering front, dressed in chandeliers and champagne. She had proof on her camera card. 43 photographs. Sharp, damning, time-stamped, a handoff between a man named Director Wu, a face she recognized from the dark corners of conservation blacklists, and a buyer she now knew represented a syndicate responsible for the slaughter of over 2,000 elephants in the last 18 months. Nia had come to Seoul to exhibit her work, to tell the story of a dying Africa through the lens of a camera. She had not come to stumble onto an active trafficking deal in the middle of a Gangnam ballroom. Walk slowly, she told herself. Don't run. Running means you know something. She was almost at the side door when the hand closed around her wrist. Not gentle. Your camera, said a voice in accented English. Low, practiced. Give it to me and I won't make a scene. She turned slowly. The man was tall, thick-necked, with eyes that had seen too many dark things and stopped caring. A silver pin on his lapel, a wolf's head, small, expensive, the kind of detail only people in certain rooms would recognize. Nia didn't know what it meant. Not yet. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice perfectly even. Her heartbeat was a different story. The photographs, he said, stepping closer, backing her toward the wall. Every file. Delete them now or I'll take the camera. And your hands with it. She had seconds. Her phone was in her clutch. Her exit was blocked. Security near the door was his. She'd clocked the way they'd looked at him when he walked in. She had no allies in this city, no one who knew her face, no backup, no plan, no. And then she saw him. He came out of the very important person elevator like the room rearranged itself around him. Tall, Korean, dressed in all black, no tie, jacket open just enough to hint at the ink crawling up the left side of his throat. Not flashy, not performing wealth the way every other man in the room was. He wore power the way other men wore cologne, like it had soaked into his skin so long ago that he'd stopped noticing it. He paused to take in the room. His eyes moved like a scanner, slow, complete, missing nothing. Nia didn't think. She moved. She crossed the floor in 10 steps, grabbed his arm with both hands, and looked up at him. And whatever was in her face in that moment, whatever desperation, fire, and sheer refusal to become a victim in a foreign country burned there, it stopped him cold. Please, she whispered. Pretend you know me. Just for a minute, please. But before we continue, kindly hit the subscribe button and tell us where you are watching from. He looked down at her. His eyes were dark, unreadable, the eyes of a man who had not been surprised in a very long time. 1 second passed. Then he moved. His arm came around her waist, firm, immediate, like she had always been exactly there, and he turned them both toward the enforcer who had frozen mid-step across the room. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the man. And something in that look, something cold, ancient, and completely without mercy, made the enforcer step back. Once, twice, then turn and walk in the opposite direction fast enough that it was almost a run. Nia exhaled for what felt like the first time in 3 minutes. Thank you, she breathed. Thank you, I'm so sorry, I'll go now, You're not going anywhere. His voice, low, quiet, accented English but clean, like he'd learned the language the same way he'd learned everything else, with complete, ruthless attention. She looked up. He was still holding her. Not tightly, not roughly, but with the absolute certainty of a man who had decided something and did not undecide. His eyes dropped to her camera, then back to her face. Whatever you photographed tonight, he said softly, has just made you the most wanted woman in Seoul. He tilted his head slightly. My car is outside. You have 30 seconds to decide if you'd like to survive the week. Nia stared at him. Her heart was doing something very stupid. I don't even know your name, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, not quite not. Kang Min-jun, he said. He started walking. And somehow, despite all the instincts she'd developed over 27 years of navigating a world that often didn't embrace women who looked, spoke, and stood firm like her, she followed. She had no way of knowing that the man she had just grabbed in a moment of desperation ran Seoul's most feared criminal empire. The Iron Veil, a name that made politicians sweat and police commissioners go quiet. She had no way of knowing that. And Min-jun, for the first time in 11 years, had no idea what to do with a woman who had grabbed him like he was a life raft, like he was safe. The car was silent, not the comfortable kind, the kind that had weight to it, the kind that pressed against your ears and made you aware of every breath you took and whether it was too loud. Nia sat in the back of the Maybach with her camera clutched in both hands and her eyes forward, watching Seoul blur past the tinted windows in rivers of neon. Pink, gold, electric blue, a city that looked like a fever dream from the inside of this car. She had gotten into a stranger's vehicle, a stranger who had not smiled at her once. A stranger whose driver had not asked where they were going because he already knew. "Idiot!" "You're talking to yourself," Min-jun said. She snapped her eyes to him. He was on the other side of the back seat, not close, but the car was only so wide, looking out his own window, one arm resting along the door, completely unbothered. "I wasn't talking," she said. "Your lips were moving." She pressed them together. He almost smiled. She was almost sure of it, a flicker, gone before it fully arrived. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Somewhere the man you made an enemy of tonight cannot reach you." "I didn't make an enemy. I took photographs at a public event," she said. "You photographed Director Wu completing a transaction that does not officially exist." He turned from the window then, and looked at her directly for the first time since the ballroom. "The man who cornered you works for a family called the Back Syndicate. They are not patient people, and they are not subtle ones." A pause. "You would have been in the Han River before sunrise." Nia's stomach dropped. She wanted to argue. She was very good at arguing. She kept her mouth shut. The Maybach turned off the main road and began to climb. The penthouse was not what she expected. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected. Something aggressive, maybe. All dark marble and weapons on the walls and men with guns standing at attention. There were security personnel. She counted 4 on the way up, stationed with the kind of stillness that meant they had been doing this a long time. But the penthouse itself, the actual living space, was almost startlingly quiet. Clean lines, warm light, an entire wall of floor-to-ceiling glass looking out over Seoul like the city was something he owned outright and simply hadn't bothered to sign the paperwork on yet. One wall held a single piece of art, large, abstract, deep ochre and black, and something that looked almost like dried earth. Kenyan sand. She stopped in front of it without meaning to. "Wangechi mutu," Min-jun said from behind her, loosening the single button on his jacket. "Acquired 3 years ago." Nia turned around slowly. "You collect African art. I collect things that interest me." He set his jacket on the back of a chair, moved to a low sideboard, and poured 2 glasses of something amber without asking if she wanted one. "Sit down. You know my name. I knew your name before you grabbed my arm." He turned and held out the glass. "Sit down." She took the glass. She did not sit down. He looked at her for a moment, that scanning look again, like he was cataloging something, and then he sat himself, crossing one ankle over his knee, completely at ease in the way that only men who had never once had to perform comfort could manage. "Your exhibition," he said. "The Fellowship. Through the Wound, Wildlife Crime and the African Landscape. It opened 4 days ago at the Dongdaemun Design Plaza. You've been in Seoul 11 days. You live alone. You have no family here, one contact at the Fellowship organization, and your return flight to Nairobi is in 3 weeks." The amber drink was very good. She barely tasted it. "You've been watching me," she said flatly. "Not you specifically. Everyone who attends events connected to Director Wu gets screened. You appeared on that list 6 days ago when you received a last-minute invitation through a Fellowship sponsor." He studied her. "What I want to know is whether you went looking for that handoff or stumbled into it. Does it matter?" Considerably, Nia set the glass down on the coffee table between them. She straightened up, squared her shoulders. That particular straightening she'd learned from her mother, who had negotiated with park rangers and poachers and corrupt government officials, and never once looked small doing it. "Exhibit my work," she said. "I was approached by a man from the fellowship board who said there were potential donors in attendance who wanted to see my portfolio in person. I went. I was photographing ambient shots for my own documentation when I noticed the exchange." She met his eyes. "I know what a trafficking handoff looks like, Mr. King. I've been documenting them for 4 years. I knew exactly what I was seeing." Something shifted in his face, very slight, like she'd said something that landed differently than he expected. "And you photographed it anyway," he said. "It's what I do." She responded. There was a brief silence. He looked at her, the way people rarely bothered, and she held it, because she had not come all the way from Nairobi to be made small in a penthouse in Seoul by a man whose name she still didn't fully trust. Then he leaned forward. "The Bake Syndicate," he said, "controls 3 of the 5 major illegal wildlife trafficking routes between East Africa and South Korea. They work with a network of corrupt officials spanning Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia." A pause, deliberate, waited, including a Kenyan politician named Minister Adongo. The name hit her like cold water. Minister Adongo. Yeah, the man whose department had signed off on the park access permits the year her mentor, David Kariuki, had been killed on location. The death that had been ruled an accident, the death Naya had spent 2 years trying to prove was anything but. Her face must have done something, because Min Jun's eyes sharpened. "You know that name," he said quietly. She said nothing. "Miss Nia?" His voice had changed. Still low, still controlled, but with something underneath it now. Something that was almost careful. "What you photographed tonight is not just evidence against the Bake family. It is a thread that connects to something much larger. And if they know what you captured..." He stopped, considered. "They will not stop at one enforcer." Nia stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Men like you don't pull strangers out of dangerous rooms out of the goodness of their hearts." She held his gaze. "So, what do you want?" Known better than to speak it at all, said, "I want the same thing you want." He picked up his glass. "I want the Beck Syndicate destroyed." He let that settle for exactly 3 seconds before he continued. "The Iron Veil and the Beck family have been in a territorial conflict for 2 years. They have taken things from me." Something passed across his face, brief, dark, contained. "I intend to take everything from them. Your photographs are evidence that can dismantle their international network, the clean, legal side of their empire, while I handle the rest." "The rest," Nia repeated. "Yes. You mean the illegal part. I mean the part that doesn't require a courtroom." She almost laughed. It wasn't funny. Nothing about this was funny. But the absolute calm with which he said it made something hysterical bubble up in her chest. "And what do I get out of this arrangement?" she asked. "Besides not being at the bottom of the Han River. Protection. Real protection. Not a hotel room with a lock and a prayer." He set his glass down. "And access. The Bake family's summit is in 10 days. Every major player in their network will be in one room. If you want Minister Adongo, if you want the truth about whatever it is that name just did to your face, that room is where you'll find it." Nia's jaw tightened. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "There is one condition," he added. "Of course there is. At the summit, and at every event leading up to it, you will attend as my companion." His eyes didn't waver. Close, convincing. "The Beg family respects power, and there is no faster way to signal power in our world than the woman a man chooses to keep beside him." The room was very quiet. Outside, Seoul glittered, indifferent and enormous. "You want me to pretend to be yours?" Nia said slowly. "You asked me to pretend to know you," he said. "Consider this an extension of that arrangement." She looked at him for a long moment. "If I say no, then I have my driver take you back to your hotel, where the Bake Syndicate's men are likely already waiting. Not cruel, just factual. The way someone states the weather. The choice is yours, Ms. Nia. I don't take unwilling companions." Nia picked her glass back up. Finished it. Set it down. 2 weeks, she said. "And I keep my camera. And if you or anyone in your organization touches my work, my files or my person without my explicit permission, Deal's off, and I take my chances with the river. Something moved in his expression, not a smile. Something quieter than a smile. Agreed, he said. She nodded once, sharp. Neither of them spoke about the fact that the deal they'd just made, in a penthouse above a city that didn't know either of their names, had already changed something. Nia could feel it. She suspected, from the way he'd stopped looking at the window and started looking at her instead, that he could too. She slept in his penthouse. Not beside him. He had 7 bedrooms, which felt like its own kind of statement, but knowing he was somewhere down that long, silent corridor made sleep come in pieces. Shallow, restless, her camera on the nightstand, like a talisman. She woke at 5 a.m. to Seoul going pink outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, and found him, already awake. He was on the terrace, standing at the glass railing with a coffee he hadn't touched, looking out at a city that was just beginning to remember it was alive. Still in black. She wasn't sure he owned another color. The early light caught the ink at his throat. She could see now that it wasn't just a color of tattoo. It traveled, intentional, deliberate, the kind of ink that told a story if you knew how to read it. She didn't, not yet. She almost went back inside. "There's coffee," he said without turning around. She stopped. "You heard me? I hear everything in this space." Still not turning. It's a habit, survival, she thought. Not paranoia, survival. She understood the difference. She'd learned it in places where the wrong sound meant something was wrong in the bush. She poured herself a cup and came to stand at the railing, not beside him, a careful 3 feet of distance, and looked out at the city. Seoul at dawn was something else entirely. The neon was gone. What was left was softer. Gold light cracking between towers. The Han River a dark ribbon in the distance. A city exhaling. "It's beautiful," she said, before she could decide not to. He looked at her then. "Yes," he said. He wasn't looking at Seoul. She pretended not to notice. By 9 a.m., 3 things had appeared in the bedroom she'd been given. A garment bag, a small black card, with a time, 7 p.m., and a location, and a woman named Ji Young, who arrived with a makeup kit the size of carry-on luggage, spoke approximately 11 words of English and communicated the remaining 100 through expressions so precise they needed no translation. "Sit. No, chin up. Stop frowning." I said stop. Nia sat. "What is tonight?" Ji Young answered in Korean. "I don't speak Korean," Nia said. Ji Young answered in Korean again, faster, as though speed would bridge the language gap, and held up a foundation 6 shades too light. "Absolutely not," Nia said. Ji Young blinked. Nia reached into her own bag and produced her own products, the ones she had traveled with for 11 days, the ones calibrated for exactly her skin on exactly her face, and placed them on the vanity in a line. Ji Young stared at them, then looked at Nia, then picked up the first one, examined it with what Nia could only describe as intense professional respect, and nodded once. Acceptable. It was the beginning of a beautiful, silent truce. Minjun was waiting in the living room when she came out at 6:45. He had his phone in his hand and was speaking to someone in Korean. Low, fast, the conversation ending the moment she appeared. He turned and stopped. She had worn the dress from the garment bag. Not because she was told to, but because it was objectively stunning and she was not going to pretend otherwise. Deep burgundy, cut to the collarbone in front, open to the mid-back behind. Against her dark skin, it looked like something lit from within. She had added her own touches. A thin gold chain, her grandmother's, at her throat. Her hair pulled back but not tamed, loose enough at the edges that it framed her face the way she liked. Her grandmother's small amber earrings. Minjun looked at her for 3 full seconds. In those 3 seconds, his expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. A shift, like a room where someone had turned up the heat by 1 degree. Barely perceptible, detectable. "You're early," he said. "I'm always early," she said. "Where are we going?" He crossed the room, stopped just inside the distance that would have been too close, and adjusted the cuff of his jacket, looking at her, not at his cuff. "A dinner," he said. "Private. 8 guests. 3 of them are Becca-line business partners who don't know they're being watched. Tonight you are not a photographer from Nairobi on a fellowship." He paused. "Tonight, you are the woman I have been keeping very quietly for the past 4 months. Educated, sharp, comfortable in these rooms. You didn't chase this life. It came to you. You stay because you choose to. That matters in my world. Understand? You want me to play a woman with power, Nia said. I want you to be yourself, he said, just without the part where you tell them what you actually think of them. She almost smiled. That's the hardest part. I know. And there it was again, that almost thing at the corner of his mouth. Try. The restaurant was underground, not hidden, underground. An entire dining space beneath a Hanam Dong building, accessible by a private elevator that required a biometric scan. Min June completed without breaking stride. The walls were raw concrete and dark walnut. The lighting was amber and low. The kind of place designed to make people feel like secrets were safe here. They weren't. That was the point. 3 men and their wives were already seated when Min June and Nia arrived. The room shifted when he walked in. It was subtle. No one stood, no one made a noise. But she felt it. A realignment. The way a room full of prey animals feels a predator enter and redistributes its attention without admitting it. He placed his hand at the small of her back. She had braced for it. She'd known it was coming. They had discussed necessary contact in the car, with the clinical efficiency of 2 people negotiating a contract. But the actual weight of his hand, warm and certain and completely unhurried, moved through her like a frequency. She kept her face still. Professional, she told herself. This is professional. The introductions moved quickly. Mr. O, shipping, Baek-aligned. Mr. Lim, finance, deep in their network. Mr. Choi, import logistics. The one Min June wanted most. 3 women beside them, who were watching Nia with the particular calculation of people trying to figure out exactly what category she belonged in. She knew that look. She'd navigated that look in Nairobi, Addis Ababa and London, and now, apparently, Seoul. She smiled at them with every watch she had. One of the wives, Mrs. O, diamonds at her ears and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, leaned across the table. You're African, she said in careful English. Where? Kenya, Nia said warmly. Nairobi. And how did you 2 meet? Mrs. O's eyes moved to Min June, with something between curiosity and an agenda Nia couldn't fully read yet. Before Nia could answer, Min June's hand moved from her back to her chair, pulling it slightly closer to his as he sat, a small gesture, completely natural, that closed the space between them, and answered the question without a single word. She's mine. We don't discuss the details. She walked into a room, he said simply, reaching for the wine, and I made sure she didn't leave. The table laughed. Nia picked up her own glass and said nothing, because if she opened her mouth right now, the first thing that would come out would be, that is not the compliment you think it is. And that was not, she reminded herself, what tonight was for. Mr. Choi's eyes were on her camera bag. She'd brought it as part of her cover, the artistic girlfriend who documents beautiful things. You're a photographer? Wildlife conservation, she said. I'm here for an international fellowship. I document ivory and rhino horn trafficking routes. She smiled over her glass. Between East Africa and Asia mostly, you'd be amazed what turns up in the photographs. The table went pleasantly on. Mr. Choi reached for his water. His hand wasn't entirely steady. Then the elevator going up. Min June said nothing for 11 floors. Then, Choi. He moved wrong when I mentioned the trafficking routes, Nia said. Right hand, his ring finger. There was a pause. Most people don't catch that, Min June said. I've spent 4 years watching people try not to react to things they know they shouldn't know. She glanced at him sideways. He's not just Baek-aligned. He's active. Min June looked at her. Not the scanning look. Something different. Something that was almost, respect. You did well tonight, he said. I know, she said. They were back at the penthouse by 11. She was at the kitchen counter with a glass of water and her laptop, pulling up her encrypted files, when he appeared in the doorway, still in his jacket, and looked at her working like it was something he needed to add to an inventory he was quietly keeping. You should sleep, he said. I will. She didn't look up. Thank you, for tonight. You handled the room well. It's what I do. I know. She glanced up then, just briefly. So do I. He stood in the doorway another moment. She looked back down at her screen. He left. She exhaled, slow, careful, deliberate, and told herself the warmth in her chest was adrenaline. She was a very good liar. About most things. What she didn't see. Min June at his desk, 40 minutes later. His lieutenant's report open in front of him. The bank syndicate's latest movements, their summit preparations, their growing paranoia about the iron veil closing in. He wasn't reading it, he was thinking about a woman who'd pulled his sleeve in a room full of wolves and somehow, impossibly, looked like the bravest thing in it. He pressed his knuckles against his mouth. This, he thought, is going to be a problem. 3 days into the arrangement, Nia established rules. Not for him. She had no illusions about her ability to govern Kang Minjun's behavior in his own fortress. But for herself, internal rules, the kind that kept a person sane when their situation had stopped making sense. Rule 1, remember why you're here. David Kariuki. 2 years of unanswered questions, the name Minister Adongo written in the margin of an accident report that was never an accident. Rule 2, the man is not your friend, he is a transaction. Treat him like one. Rule 3, do not notice things about him that are not relevant to the mission. She was already failing Rule 3 spectacularly. It wasn't her fault. He was noticeable, not in the obvious ways. Not the face, not the build, not the way a room reorganized around him like iron filings around a magnet. Though all of that was true and she wasn't blind. It was the smaller things, the things that didn't fit the architecture of what he was supposed to be. He read, constantly. Physical books. No e-reader, no audiobook. Korean, English, and what she was fairly certain was French, stacked in 3 separate piles on his desk by language as if they were different conversations he was having simultaneously. He cooked his own breakfast, every morning, quietly, competently, nothing elaborate, eggs, rice, pickled vegetables, but with the focused attention of someone for whom the act of feeding himself was not something he had ever outsourced. He had a plant. One, a small, unremarkable succulent on the windowsill of his office that he watered every Tuesday and Thursday with the measured precision of a man who had read the instructions and followed them exactly. She had noticed the plant on day 2. On day 3, she caught herself wondering how long he'd had it. Rule 3, Nia, Rule 3. The cultural exchange happened by accident, the way the best things do. Day 4, late afternoon. She sat at the dining table, surrounded by her laptop and files, immersed in the particular focused silence she relied on as a shield. Then, he emerged from his office, pausing at the kitchen, and she heard it. He was cooking something that smelled like nothing she recognized, and he was doing it with the faint, controlled frustration of a man who had followed a recipe precisely and gotten a result he didn't trust. She looked up. He was staring at a pot of something pale and thin, as though it had personally disappointed him. "What are you making?" she asked. "Juk," he said. "Rice porridge, He stopped. "It doesn't matter. Are you sick?" A pause that told her everything. "No," he said. She got up. He watched her cross the kitchen with an expression caught between pride and the specific helplessness of someone who had been unwell for approximately 12 hours and had been refusing to acknowledge it, because acknowledging it meant admitting a vulnerability he didn't know how to hold. She looked at the pot, looked at him. His jaw was set. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine. Kang Minjun." She said it the way her mother used to say her full name, not loud, worse than loud, certain. "Sit down." Something flickered across his face. He sat down. She found what she needed in his kitchen, which was enormous and stocked with an almost aggressive thoroughness. And she made him uji. Not the powdered kind. Proper uji, the way her grandmother made it, the way she had made it for herself every time she was sick or tired, or the world had been too heavy for one day. Millet flour and water and a patience you could not rush, stirred slow and steady until it thickened into something warm and real. She found ginger and added it. Honey from a jar near the back of the pantry. He watched her from the kitchen island. Quiet. That total, unblinking attention he gave things he hadn't categorized yet. "What is that?" he asked. "Uji, Kenyan millet porridge." She stirred without looking up. "My grandmother made it when I was sick as a child." She said it carried the strength of the grain and the patience of the person who made it into whoever ate it. A pause. She was a very poetic woman. There was silence. "She's gone?" he asked. The question was quiet. No performance of sympathy. Just the direct, undecorated question of someone who had learned that clean words landed softer than elaborate ones. 3 years ago, Nia said. "Yes." Another silence, different from the first one. My mother made juk when I was sick, he said finally. When I was small. Before. He stopped. The sentence ended somewhere he didn't take her. It's the only thing I know how to make that actually works. But I always get the consistency wrong. She finally looked at him. He was looking at the counter, not avoiding her, just somewhere distant for a moment. A man briefly the age he'd been before whatever had made him into what he was now. She put the uji in front of him. He looked at it, looked at her. Try it, she said, going back to her side of the table. And drink water, you're probably dehydrated. He tried it. She pretended to be very interested in her laptop. It's good, he said. Low. Like the words cost something. I know, she said. Across the table something shifted. She felt it without looking up. The transaction had just developed a crack. She taught him the word that night. Uji. They were on the terrace. His idea, which surprised her. He'd appeared in the doorway of the living room and said, simply, outside. The way you'd say it to someone you'd stopped needing to perform for. And the city was doing its nighttime thing below them, and he was warmer than he'd been in the morning, the color back in his face. Uji! He repeated, careful, precise. He had the absolute concentration of someone who refused to do anything badly. Better, she said. Again, Uji, good. He looked at her sideways. Swahili? It's the national language of Kenya. She pulled her knees up to her chest on the terrace chair. And Tanzania, and Uganda, and parts of Mozambique, Rwanda, DRC. She caught herself. Sorry, I become educational when I'm comfortable. It's a habit. He said nothing, but he had clocked the word. Comfortable. She could feel it. How many languages do you speak? He asked. 5, English, Swahili, Kikuyu, French, and basic Amharic. She glanced at him. You? Korean, English, Japanese, Mandarin? A beat. Basic Russian. For business? For survival. He turned his glass slowly in his hand. They mean the same thing where I come from. She considered asking where that was. What that had looked like. Who he'd been before the iron veil, before the tattoos and the mabak and the room that rearranged around him. She didn't. Not yet. Teach me something, he said instead. She looked at him. In Swahili? Something useful, she thought for a moment. Ninahitaji ukweli, she said. He repeated it slowly, imperfect but close. What does it mean? She looked back at the city. I need the truth, she said. The silence that followed was the kind that meant more than either of them was ready to say. Day 6. A problem arrived in the form of a man named Ha-Eun, Min-jun's second lieutenant, narrow-faced and watchful, who had been in her peripheral vision since the first night, and had the particular energy of someone whose loyalty was a weather system she couldn't fully read. He arrived mid-morning while Min-jun was on a call, and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at Nia with eyes that were almost friendly. Almost. You're adapting quickly, he said in perfect English. I'm a quick adapter, she said without looking up from her laptop. The men are curious about you. He poured himself coffee, like he'd done it 1,000 times in this kitchen. It's not usual, him bringing someone here. I'm sure it's not. He's never brought anyone here, Ha-Eun said. In 6 years, not once. She looked up now. Ha-Eun smiled. It didn't reach his eyes, but it was sophisticated. The smile of someone who understood that the most dangerous moves looked like conversation. The summit is in 4 days, he said. A lot of powerful people in one room. A lot of reasons for things to go wrong. He tilted his head slightly. For everyone. She held his gaze. Is that a warning? She asked. It's an observation, he said pleasantly. He left. Nia closed her laptop. Her heart was doing something careful and calculating. Because she had heard what he actually said, underneath the words he'd used. She had been in enough rooms with enough dangerous men to know that observation and threat were often the same sentence wearing different clothes. Ha-Eun wasn't just watching her. He was measuring something. The question was whether he was measuring it for Min-jun or against him. She found Min-jun 20 minutes later, in his office, the call finished. He was at his desk looking at something on his screen that he closed the moment she appeared. Not suspicious, just private. He had many private things. She had stopped taking it personally and started cataloging it instead. Ha-Yun just spoke to me, she said. He looked up. She told him exactly what had been said, exactly how it had been said, and exactly what she thought it meant. Minjun listened. He was exceptional at listening. No interruptions, no expressions, the complete and slightly unnerving stillness of someone processing information at a speed that didn't require visible reaction. When she finished, the silence lasted 4 seconds. "What made you read it as a threat?" he asked. "The coffee," she said. He waited. "He helped himself to your kitchen like he owns it, but the way he looked at me while he did it, he was establishing something. I belong here. You don't." The words were almost friendly. The staging wasn't. Minjun leaned back in his chair. He looked at her for a long moment. That look again, the one that made her feel like she was being added to a ledger in a language she couldn't read. "Most people who've met Ha-Yun," he said carefully, "come away thinking he's charming. Most people," Nia said, "aren't paying attention." Something happened in his face then. Not the almost smile, something quieter, something that moved through his expression like a current moving under still water. Deep and real, and not for anyone else. He stood, crossed around the desk, stopped in front of her, close, but with that deliberate, careful distance he always maintained, like proximity was something he rationed. "The summit," he said. "When we're in that room—" He stopped, reconsidered his words with the precision of someone who had learned that the wrong sentence was irreversible. "Stay in my line of sight. At all times." "Because of Ha-Yun?" she asked. "Because—" another pause, shorter, harder to read. "Because I have decided you are not going to get hurt in this, and I keep my decisions." She looked up at him, this close she could see the full geography of the ink at his throat. Characters, she realized, Korean characters threaded through the design, too small to read from across the room. "What did the tattoo say?" she asked, before Rule 3 could stop her. He was very still. "Naomba usisahau," she added softly. "I'm asking. You don't have to answer." Something passed through his face. He reached up, slowly, like the motion cost him, and pulled the collar of his shirt aside. Just slightly, just enough. The characters ran up the left side of his neck in a single column. Shengjewe Guoke. "Chinese," he said quietly. "It means, the living are only passing through." There was a pause. My father's words. He said them the morning he died. The weight that lived underneath the words, dense and old and carried. I put them where I can't see them, but anyone who gets close enough can. The terrace, the almost smiles, the succulent on the windowsill, the living are only passing through. Nia didn't speak. She reached out, slowly, with the same deliberateness he always used, and touched the inside of his wrist. Not his hand, not a hold, just contact, brief and warm and human. "Pull," she said softly. In Swahili, it means, "I'm sorry for your pain." We say it like a breath, like the word itself is gentle. He looked at her hand on his wrist. He didn't move away. "Pull," he repeated, very quiet. The city hummed 30 floors below them. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then his phone rang, sharp and clinical, splitting the air, and the moment folded up and put itself away. He answered it in Korean. His face went back to what it usually was, closed, certain, unreadable. She went back to the living room. She sat down at the table, opened her laptop, and stared at a screen she wasn't reading. Rule 2, she thought. He is a transaction. She pressed her fingers to the inside of her own wrist, where she could still feel the ghost of where she'd reached for him. "You are such a liar, Nia." It started with rain. Seoul didn't ease into it. The sky simply decided, all at once, that it was done holding back, and came down in sheets that turned the city's lights into watercolors bleeding into each other. From the penthouse it looked almost violent. Beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they remind you how small you are. Nia had been awake since 2 a.m. Not unusual. Her body still hadn't fully forgiven the time zone, and her mind had stopped being cooperative the moment Ha-Yun had smiled at her over a coffee cup, and said things that weren't what they were. She was on the terrace. Covered section, rain, just close enough to feel as mist, with her camera in her lap and no particular intention, when she started shooting the city. Not for the fellowship, not for documentation, just because, the way she had when she was 19 and first understood that a lens could hold something the eye alone would let go. She didn't hear him until he was already there. He appeared in the terrace doorway, in a dark fitted shirt, no jacket, feet bare, and stopped when he saw her. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, without lowering the camera. "I don't sleep much," he said. "I never have." She lowered the camera and looked at him properly. There was something different about him at 2 a.m. in bare feet with rain behind him. The armor was still there, it was structural, it was him, she didn't think it fully came off, but it sat differently, lighter, like a coat worn open instead of buttoned. "Sit down," she said. "You're letting the cold in." He sat, not across from her this time. Beside her, one seat between them, which in the geometry of this terrace and this hour felt closer than it was. For a while neither of them spoke. The rain did all the work. "Can I see?" he asked. She looked at him. He nodded toward the camera. No one asked to see her work mid-shoot. People either waited for the exhibition or they didn't. It was one of her rules. The camera is mine, the work is mine, the eye behind it is mine. A boundary she'd constructed early and kept firmly. She handed him the camera. He held it the way people held unfamiliar things that deserved respect. Carefully, with both hands, not performing confidence he didn't have. He looked at the screen. Scrolled slowly. Seoul in rain. The river dissolving. A streak of red neon fractured across wet glass. The city from 30 floors up looking like something dreamed. He didn't say these are good the way people said it, reflexive, social, meaning nothing. He said, "You see it differently." "See what?" "Everything." Single bridge light reflected in a long gold line. Most people who photograph cities photograph the buildings. You photograph what the city does to light. Nia looked at him. He was still looking at the screen. "My mentor said that," she said quietly. "The first time he looked at my work, he said, 'Nia, you don't photograph places, you photograph what places feel like.'" She paused. "David Kariuki. He was the one who taught me everything about field documentation, about using a camera as testimony." Minjun was still. "The one who died," he said, not a question. He remembered. "They said he fell," she said. "Wrong footing on a ridge in Laikipia. An accident." The word tasted the same way it always did, like something rotten dressed up clean. He had been photographing elephant carcasses along a route that connected to a buyer network that connected, eventually, to Minister Adongo's department. She looked out at the rain. He wasn't careless. He'd worked that terrain for 20 years. He knew every ridge, every rock, every... She stopped, pressed her lips together. "He didn't fall." There was silence. "No," Minjun said. "He didn't." She turned to him sharply. His jaw was set. He was looking at the river shot still, or pretending to. "What do you know?" she asked. He handed the camera back. The motion was deliberate, giving her the thing that was hers, before saying the thing that wasn't easy. "Adongo didn't order it directly," he said. "He doesn't get his hands close to anything. He has a man, a facilitator, who handles removals when the network feels exposed." He paused. "Your mentor had gotten close enough that 3 separate syndicate partners flagged him as a liability in the same week. That's the threshold. 3 flags." Nia's hands were very still on the camera. "You knew this," she said. "Before I came here. You knew who David was. I knew he was collateral damage in a network I've been building a case against for 2 years." His voice was even, not cold, careful. There was a difference she'd learned. "I didn't know he was yours." Yours. The word landed strangely. David had been her mentor, her North Star, her proof that the work mattered. And Minjun had just said yours, like he understood the weight of that without needing it explained. She exhaled slowly. "The summit," she said. "Adongo will be there." "Yes." "In the same room." "Yes." She looked at him. "You were going to tell me." "I was going to tell you when I was certain you wouldn't do something that got you killed before we got there." She should have been angry. The anger was there, real and justified, but she chose to set it aside. This wasn't the time for it. She was too exhausted, the rain was too loud, and David had been gone for 2 years. She sat 30 floors above Seoul, next to a man whose presence was unsettling, someone who had just said yours with an intensity that suggested he knew more than he should, but in that moment she was too tired to react. "I need the evidence to be clean," she said finally. "Whatever you're planning for the Baek family, Adongo goes through legal channels, courts, documentation. I need the world to see what he did." Minjun looked at her. For David, she said. For David, he repeated. He said it like a contract. She found the ledger 40 minutes later, not snooping. She'd gone inside for water and taken the wrong door in the dark, and found herself in a room she hadn't been in before. Small, spare. A desk, a laptop, a filing cabinet, and a single corkboard on the wall covered in photographs and documents connected by threads of red string. She should have left. She stepped closer instead. The photographs were of places she knew in her bones, the red earth of Savo, the acacia lines of the Masai Mara, a waterhole in the Okavango she had photographed herself 3 years ago. Conservation sites, sanctuary locations, anti-poaching patrol routes. Her eyes moved to the documents. Wire transfers, anonymous, routed through 4 different holding entities before landing at, she leaned closer, the East African Wildlife Covenant Fund, the Nairobi Animal Rescue Collective, the Amboseli Elephant Research Foundation. Numbers that weren't small, numbers that represented years of sustained anonymous funding. Then she heard him in the doorway. She turned around. Minjun stood there, reading her face, the shock, the recalibration, the something she couldn't fully name that was happening in her chest. He said nothing. How long, she asked. There was a pause. 8 years. Why? He looked at the corkboard, then back at her, and something in his face, beneath the control, beneath the armor, in that 2 a.m. space where the coat hung open, was almost painfully honest. Because someone has to, he said, and the people who should aren't. She looked at him for a long time, this man, this architect of violence and control and criminal empire, who watered a succulent twice a week, and couldn't get juk consistency right, and had his dead father's words tattooed, where only the people closest to him could read them, who had been quietly funding the world she had given her life to protect, for 8 years, anonymously, without telling anyone. You're not what you look like, she said softly. Neither are you, he said. You look like someone who photographs beautiful things. You're actually someone who walks into rooms full of wolves because someone has to witness. She felt the words land somewhere deep and specific. Witness. He had found the exact word. She crossed the room. She didn't plan it. Rule 2 and Rule 3 both dissolved in the same second, cleanly, like paper and water. And she stopped in front of him and looked up, and his eyes came down to her face, and the space between them became something neither of them had agreed to, but both of them had been building toward since a ballroom in Gangnam, and a desperate whisper and a hand closing around his sleeve. His hand came up, slowly, with that characteristic deliberateness, the man who did nothing without intention. His fingers touched her jaw, light, questioning. She didn't move back. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and she felt it everywhere. A frequency. A warmth. A thing that had no business being this large this quickly, except that nothing about this had followed any rules she knew. Nia, he said. Just her name, the way he said it. Like he'd been holding it carefully. Like something he didn't want to damage. She tilted her face up. He leaned down. His phone detonated on the desk beside them. Not a ring, a specific alert, 3 pulses, sharp and urgent, that made his entire body shift from present to operational in under a second. He pulled back. His eyes went to the phone, then back to her face, and the look in them was frustrated, in a way she had never seen from him. Not cold frustration, human frustration. The particular agony of a man whose life has terrible timing. He picked up the phone, read the message. His jaw tightened. What is it? She asked, already knowing the warmth of the almost moment was gone, folded away with the rest of the things the city kept interrupting. He turned the phone so she could see. 1 line. From a number with no name. The photographer is a liability. Summit authorization requested. H. She read it twice. H. Ha-Yoon. The authorization he was requesting. She didn't need Minjun to explain what it meant in his world. She had been in enough rooms with enough dangerous men. He was asking permission to have her removed. Minjun's thumb hovered over the screen. He looked at her. Something in his face had gone very still. The stillness of a man standing at a crossroads that has just revealed itself to be sharper than he expected. She held his gaze and said nothing, because she understood in that moment, with complete clarity, this was the test. Not for her. For him. What Kang Minjun did in the next 30 seconds would tell her everything. He typed 1 word back. No, just that. No punctuation. No explanation. The way a man says no when he has never once in his life needed to justify it. Then he put the phone face down on the desk and looked at Nia with eyes that had gone somewhere she hadn't seen before. Not cold, not calculating. Something older than both of those things. Something that had made a decision and was done negotiating with itself about it. Go to your room, he said quietly. Lock the door. Minjun, not because you're in danger. His voice was low even. The verbal equivalent of a hand pressed flat against a surface to stop it shaking. Because what happens next is not something you should see. She looked at him. I've seen difficult things, she said. Not like this. His eyes held hers. Please, Nia. The please was what moved her. This man did not say please. She had catalogued 11 days of his vocabulary, and the word had never appeared. Not with his staff, not with his lieutenants, not with the dangerous men who moved through this penthouse like weather systems passing through. He said it to her. She went. She didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed with her camera in her lap and listened to the penthouse breathe around her. At first, nothing. Silence so complete she could hear the rain still working against the glass. Then, voices. One of them Minjun's, low and controlled and in Korean, which meant she caught nothing but tone. And tone was enough. She had heard anger performed, loud, explosive, theatrical. This was not that. This was something colder and more deliberate, the vocal equivalent of a blade being drawn slowly. A second voice, higher, faster, defensive, Ha-yun. Then silence again, longer this time, the kind of silence that had weight. Then a single sound, sharp, short, physical, that she felt in her back teeth. Then nothing. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and breathed. Minjun appeared in her doorway 40 minutes later. He had changed his shirt. She noticed that immediately. The white shirt he'd been wearing was gone, replaced by black. And she understood without asking why. And the understanding sat in her chest, like a stone dropped in still water, rippling outward into things she didn't have words for yet. He looked at her sitting on the edge of the bed with her camera and her composed face and her eyes that missed nothing. And something in his expression did a complicated, quiet thing. It's handled, he said. Is he alive? A pause. He won't be a problem. She nodded slowly. What did he want? Actually want, the authorization was the surface. Minjun leaned against the doorframe, not entering, respecting the threshold, which was a thing she had noticed he always did with her space. Ha-in has been building a case for succession for 2 years, he said. He believed the Iron Veil needed new leadership. He believed I had become... A careful pause, distracted, by me, by the idea of you. His voice didn't change. You were here 4 days and he already saw something he thought he could use. He looked at her steadily. He was going to hand you to the Baek family before the summit. Proof of his loyalty to their new alliance. A gesture. The stone in her chest dropped further. He was going to trade me, she said. Yes, like cargo. Something moved across Minjun's face. Brief and dark and deeply personal. No one in my organization, he said quietly, will ever touch you. That has been made very clear tonight, to everyone. The way he said everyone told her the message had not been delivered gently. She should have been more frightened than she was. She was aware of that, the gap between how afraid she logically should be and how afraid she actually felt. The man in her doorway had just done something violent. She had heard it. She had seen the changed shirt. And yet, what she felt, looking at him, was not fear. It was something far more inconvenient. Come here, she said. He stilled. Not like that, she said, and almost smiled despite everything. Just, come here, sit down. You look like a man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and refuses to put it down. He looked at her for a moment, that long cataloging look, and then he crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the window. Not on the bed, the chair, which told her everything about the kind of man he was in the spaces where no one was watching. She turned to face him. Show me your hands, she said. His eyes narrowed slightly. Nia, show me. He held them out, steady, unhesitating. The hands of a man who had never apologized for what they'd done. The left knuckle was split, barely, just the skin, already stopping. And she got up without comment and came back with the small first aid kit she traveled with everywhere, because 4 years in the field had taught her that someone always needed it. He watched her clean the cut, with the focused stillness of someone receiving something they didn't know how to ask for. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "What I am?" She pressed a small bandage over the knuckle, smoothed the edges. "It bothers me," she said carefully, "that a world exists where you became necessary." She looked up at him. "That's different from it bothering me that you exist." His jaw moved. "That's a very precise distinction," he said. "I'm a very precise person." The rain had softened outside, from assault to conversation, the city settling into something quieter and more honest. "When I was 22, Minjun said, and she went very still because he had never, not once, begun a sentence that way, with my younger brother was killed, by the Baek family. He was 19, he had nothing to do with this world. He was studying architecture, he wanted to build things, he used to draw floor plans on napkins in restaurants because he couldn't stop thinking about space and light, and, He stopped. His hands were very still in his lap. "He was in the wrong place," he said. "A territorial message from the Baeks to my father, who ran a small protection operation in Mapo. They didn't even know my brother's name. He was a symbol, a full stop at the end of a sentence." His voice didn't break, it was worse than breaking. It was the voice of someone who had processed this so many times that the grief had become structural, load-bearing, built into the architecture of everything he was. "I built the iron veil so that no one in this city could ever again use the people I love as punctuation." The room was very quiet. Nia looked at him. This man, this empire, this collection of silences and tattoos and succulents and anonymous wire transfers and a dead brother named after nothing she knew yet, and felt something in her chest that Rule 2 and Rule 3 had absolutely no framework for. She reached out and covered his hands with both of hers. Not brief this time. Not a question. A statement. "I hear you. I see you. I'm not going anywhere." He looked down at her hands over his. Then he turned his right hand over, slowly, like the motion was being decided in real time, and held hers, not tightly, just held, like something he was allowing himself, possibly for the first time in a very long time. She fell asleep in the chair. She didn't mean to. The adrenaline of the night had burned through whatever had been keeping her upright, and somewhere between the rain and the quiet, and the warmth of a room that had stopped pretending to be something it wasn't, her body simply gave up the fight. She woke to pale morning light and the soft weight of a blanket around her shoulders that had not been there before. Her camera was on the windowsill, placed there carefully, lens cap on. She looked at the chair beside her. Empty, but warm. She pulled the blanket tighter and looked out at a Seoul that was washed clean and gold and gleaming. The city after confession. The city after rain. The city after two people had sat in a dark room and told each other true things. On the windowsill beside her camera was a single item. A napkin. On it, in handwriting that was precise and architectural and suggested someone who had been taught to write with absolute intention. "We enter the summit tomorrow at 8 p.m. I stay in my line of sight. MJ," and underneath, in smaller letters, like an afterthought that had taken courage. "My brother's name was Seo Jun. He would have liked you." Nia pressed the napkin flat against her palm, closed her eyes, breathed. Rule 2, she thought distantly. He is a transaction. She folded the napkin very carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her camera bag, the pocket where she kept David's last field note, the one she'd found in his equipment after the funeral, the one that said simply, "Keep witnessing. Someone has to." 2 pieces of paper, 2 men who had decided the world needed people willing to stand in the dark and hold a light. She stood up, checked her camera, checked her files, rolled her shoulders back. That straightening, her mother's gift to her, the one that said, "I know what I'm walking into and I'm walking in anyway." Tomorrow night, the summit, a dongo in the same room, the Baek family's entire empire in one place, and Kang Min-jun, the most dangerous man in Seoul, who had held her hand like it was something he was allowing himself possibly for the first time in a very long time. She was ready. God help everyone else in that room. She wore red, not the burgundy of the first dinner. This was different. This was red the way fire is red, the way warning signs are red, the way something is red when it has decided to be absolutely, unapologetically seen. Ji-young had brought it that morning without a word, hanging it on the back of the bedroom door, and stepping back with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who understood that some dresses were not chosen. They chose. Nia had looked at it for a long time. Then she'd put it on, floor length, one shoulder, a neckline that was elegant and deliberate. Against her skin it looked like she had been poured into something molten, and it had cooled into exactly this shape. Her grandmother's gold chain, her amber earrings, camera bag, compact, discreet, the modified one she used for field operations where visibility was a liability. She was ready at 7:15. Boo. He was in the living room. Black suit. She had decided he owned 40 versions of the same black suit, each one cut with the kind of precision that suggested the tailor had been personally threatened, with a single dark lapel pin. The iron veils mark, small, deliberate. The same way everything about him was deliberate. He turned when she walked in, and this time he didn't look away before she caught it. His eyes moved over her. Once, complete, unhurried, and what lived in them in that moment was not the controlled neutrality he wore like a second skin. It was something unguarded and honest and devastating in its simplicity. You, his eyes said. It was always going to be you. He looked away, adjusted his cuff. You're wearing red, he said. I am. To a room full of people who will be looking for reasons to target you. Yes, she picked up her bag. Let them look. He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the room, stopped in front of her, and reached into his jacket pocket, produced a bracelet, simple, white gold. A single dark stone at the center that caught light and held it. It has a transmitter, he said, matter-of-factly, taking her wrist and fastening it before she could respond. If we get separated, press the stone twice. My team will find you in under 3 minutes. She looked at the bracelet, then at him. It's also beautiful, she said. That's incidental, he said immediately. Is it? He said nothing, but he didn't let go of her wrist for a moment longer than the fastening required. The helmet was held in a building that didn't exist on any public map. 40 floors underground, an architectural marvel of criminal ambition, built beneath a legitimate convention center in Gyeonggu, accessible only through a series of security checkpoints that made government black sites look casual. Biometric scans, signal blocking, the kind of infrastructure that took decades and billions to construct and existed because the people who built it had long since stopped believing any legitimate system would ever touch them. They arrived at 8:02. Minjun's hand was at her back, and tonight it was different from the first dinner, different from the practiced performance of the Hanamdong restaurant. Tonight it was positioned lower, more certain, the hand of a man not demonstrating ownership for an audience but expressing something he had privately, irrevocably decided. She felt it in her spine. The room opened before them. It was enormous, a circular space. Intentional, she understood immediately, no head of the table, no hierarchy visible in the architecture. Filled with perhaps 80 people, men and women from 7 countries, dressed in the universal language of serious money, Korean, Chinese, Japanese, European, a scattering of African faces she clocked immediately. Business representatives she suspected, some legitimate, most not. And there, across the room, laughing at something with 2 Korean men in expensive suits, Minister Adongo. She had seen his face in photographs for 2 years. He was shorter than she'd imagined. Rounder. The face of someone's pleasant uncle. The kind of man whose harmlessness was his greatest weapon, because no one looked at pleasant uncles and thought this man signed the paperwork that killed my mentor. Nia's jaw tightened. Minjun's hand pressed, barely, at her back. Not yet, that pressure said. I see him, I know. Not yet. She breathed. Sss. The first hour was theater. She played her role, warm, composed. The kind of woman who belonged in rooms like this not because she'd been placed here, but because she had decided to grace it with her presence. She spoke when spoken to and deflected when necessary, and kept her smile calibrated to pleasant opacity, revealing nothing, inviting everything, the expression of a woman who knew more than she was saying. Minjun worked the room like a general walking a battlefield, unhurried, seeing everything, giving each conversation exactly as much as it was worth, and not one syllable more. 3 times men tried to pull him into side conversations away from her. 3 times he redirected them back toward her or moved the conversation to where she stood. She wasn't sure he was conscious of doing it. She was absolutely certain she was conscious of noticing it. The Baek family's head, Chairman Baek Sung-il, 70 years old, a face carved from something geological, watched them from across the room with eyes that had survived too much to be surprised by anything. He was surprised by her, she could tell. The particular quality of his attention, the way it kept returning to her, recalibrating, told her she was a variable he hadn't accounted for. Good. The break in the evening came at 9:30. A natural pause in the proceedings. Drinks refreshed, conversations scattered, the room fragmenting into smaller clusters. Min Jun was pulled aside by a Japanese associate. Something urgent in the body language, the man gripping his forearm, eyes doing the specific thing eyes do when money is disappearing somewhere it shouldn't. Min Jun looked at Nia. 3 minutes, his eyes said. Stay visible. She nodded. She moved toward the side of the room, a position she'd identified an hour ago, good sightlines. Her back to a wall, the main floor spread before her like a stage. She was there for 40 seconds before Minister Adongo appeared beside her. She had not seen him move. That pleasantness, that uncle face. Up close it was even more practiced. The easy smile, the open posture, the deliberate performance of a man who had spent 30 years making people underestimate him. Beautiful event, he said in English. Kenyan accent, warm, familiar. Extraordinary, she agreed. I couldn't help noticing. You're Kenyan. His eyes were friendly and absolutely calculating. Nairobi? Born and raised, she said. Wonderful city. He sipped his drink. And what brings you to an event like this? She smiled at him. The smile she had learned in the field, the one that said, I'm harmless, I'm open, I'm exactly what I appear to be. The smile that had gotten her within, photographing distance, of things that would have killed her if they'd known what she was doing. She let her eyes move briefly, warmly toward where Min Jun stood across the room. He thought I should see more of Seoul's private landscape. Adongo followed her gaze. When he looked back at her, something in the pleasant uncle face had shifted, microscopic. But there, Kang Min Jun, he said carefully. She sipped her drink. Interesting man to be close to. There was a pause weighted with something she was supposed to be afraid of. Dangerous world for someone in conservation. Another pause. Accidents happen in dangerous worlds. I'm sure you know that. There it was, under the pleasantness, under the uncle face. The same man who had signed the paperwork, who had looked at David Kariuki and seen a full stop at the end of a sentence. She looked at him, directly, completely, with 27 years of fury compressed into absolute stillness. I know a great deal about accidents, she said softly. I've been documenting them for 4 years. She smiled. It was lovely to meet you, Minister. She turned to move and walked directly into a wall of black suit. Except it wasn't a wall. It was Min Jun. She had crossed the room without her seeing him move. She had no idea how a man that present moved, that invisibly. And he was standing behind her, and from the angle of his body and the particular quality of his stillness, she understood he had been there for at least the last 30 seconds of that conversation. He had heard everything. He looked at Adongo, and Adongo, with all his decades of political survival, all his practiced pleasantness, all his uncle face, went pale, because whatever lived in Min Jun's expression in that moment was not anger. Anger was loud and visible and could be managed. This was something else. The cold, absolute certainty of a man who had added a name to a list and was already planning the last item on it. Minister, Min Jun said. One word, the man's title. Nothing else. Adongo nodded, too quickly, and left. Min Jun turned to her. His eyes went over her face the way they always did, that inventory, and whatever he was checking for, he found it. You're all right, he said. I'm furious, she said. But yes, something moved in his jaw. He threatened you. He implied. He's careful. She held Min Jun's gaze. I got it on audio. She touched the bracelet. The transmitter records. He stared at her. The recording started the moment he approached me, she said. Clean audio, him placing himself at her level. The implication about accidents. She straightened. It's not enough for a court by itself, but it's a thread. The right investigator pulls it. Everything unravels, Min Jun said quietly. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the almost smile, not the cataloging look. Something open, something that had given up pretending it wasn't what it was. You did that on purpose, he said. You drew him to you. He was always going to find me eventually, she said. I just chose the time and the place. The room continued around them, conversations, deals, the architecture of a criminal world conducting its business. And Min Jun stood in the middle of it looking at her, like she had just rearranged something fundamental in his internal geography. The exposure happened at 10:47. Chairman Baek Sung-il called the room to attention from the center. No microphone needed, the voice of a man who had never once needed amplification, and began to speak in Korean that one of Min Jun's men translated quietly in her earpiece. She heard the witness. She heard the photographer. She heard Kang Min Jun's woman, a liability he has allowed sentiment to create. The room turned, 80 sets of eyes, finding her, the red dress, her grandmother's gold, her camera bag and her amber earrings, and her back straight as a sentence that has decided what it means. She did not move. Chairman Baek was still speaking. The photographs, the evidence, the threat she represented to their collective operation. His voice was calm and legislative, the voice of a man presenting a problem and expecting consensus on its solution. The solution was obvious. She felt it in the room like a temperature drop. Min Jun stood beside her. She felt him make his decision before he moved, felt it in the shift of his weight, in the breath he took that was different from his other breaths, in the way his hand found her waist and pulled her against his side with a certainty that had nothing to do with performance. He held up one hand. The room went silent. He spoke in Korean. 4 sentences, clean and absolute, not loud, not theatrical. The translation came through her earpiece a half-second later, and each word landed like something being hammered into stone. She is under iron veil protection. Her safety is my personal guarantee. Any move against her is a declaration against me. I suggest you consider very carefully what that has historically meant for the people who tried it. There was silence, complete, total. Then Chairman Baek smiled and said, in English, for her benefit, which told her he was more sophisticated than she'd given him credit for. You'd sacrifice your empire for a woman you've known 11 days, Min Jun? Min Jun looked at him. Then he looked at Nia, and she saw it. Fully, finally, undisguised. Everything he had been rationing since a ballroom in Gangnam, and a desperate whisper, and a hand on his sleeve. He turned back to Chairman Baek. I'd burn it down, he said simply. Then he pulled her in and kissed her. Then not a performance, that was the thing. That was what the room felt, and why the silence that followed was a different quality of silence entirely. A performance could be measured and managed and dismissed. This was not that. His hand was at her jaw, tilted up, like something precious, and he kissed her with the focused, unhurried certainty of a man who had been deciding this for 11 days, and had finally stopped arguing with himself about it. She kissed him back. Because Rule 2 was ash. Because Rule 3 had never stood a chance. Because David's note said, keep witnessing, and sometimes witnessing meant standing in a room full of wolves in a red dress, and choosing, loudly, completely, with her whole chest, the most dangerous man in it. When they broke apart, the room was still silent. Chairman Baek was no longer smiling. And somewhere across the room, Minister Adongo was looking at his phone with hands that weren't steady. Because in the last 4 minutes, 3 encrypted files had arrived in the inbox of South Korea's National Investigation Service, Interpol's Wildlife Crime Division, and Kenya's Independent Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, sent from a camera bag, by a woman in a red dress, while everyone was watching the kiss. Min Jun felt her exhale against him. He pulled back just enough to look at her face, searching that inventory, and found her eyes bright, furious and alive, and something else entirely. You sent them, he said quietly. During, she confirmed. He looked at her. The living are only passing through, his father had said, but standing here, in this room, with this woman who had whispered to him in a ballroom and dismantled an international criminal network while he kissed her. For the first time in a very long time, Kang Min Jun felt something that was the precise opposite of passing through. He felt arrived, in 40 minutes. Not dramatically, no sirens, no raid, no moment of cinematic collapse. That wasn't how these worlds ended. They ended the way they had been built, quietly, deliberately, one careful move at a time. The moment the files hit 3 separate government inboxes simultaneously, certain phones in that room began to vibrate. Certain faces changed. Certain men excused themselves from conversations they would never finish. Chairman Baek Sung-il left without looking at Minjun again. That was how she knew it was over. Not the files, not the exposure. The fact that a man who had ruled Seoul's underworld for 30 years walked out of a room without looking at the person who had just dismantled him, because looking would have meant acknowledging, and acknowledging would have meant accepting that he had lost to a woman in a red dress with a camera bag and 11 days. Minister Adongo was still in the building when the first call came through on his personal phone. She watched his face from across the room as he answered it. She watched it change. The pleasant uncle face, layer by layer, like paint stripped by something chemical, until what was underneath was just a frightened man holding a phone in a room that had run out of exits. He looked at her. She held his gaze. This is for David, she thought. Every photograph, every file, every year of carrying this is for David. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Minjun got her out of the building at 11:20. Not rushing. He never rushed. It was one of the things about him that had stopped unnerving her and started feeling like bedrock, but with the efficient purposefulness of someone executing a plan that had been ready since before tonight began. The Maybach was waiting. They didn't speak until they were moving. Seoul sliding past the windows again, the city indifferent and luminous. The same city it had been 3 hours ago when everything was still loaded and waiting to detonate. Then Minjun said, "The files. Triple encrypted," she said. "Backed up to 4 separate servers before I left the penthouse tonight. The copies the agencies received are authenticated and time-stamped. Chain of evidence is clean." She looked at her hands in her lap. "David taught me that. Document everything twice and then document it again. Assume someone will try to make it disappear." Silence. "He trained you well," Minjun said. "He trained me to survive him," she said. "To keep going when he couldn't." The city moved. "How long will it take," she asked, "for the investigation to move?" "Interpol, weeks possibly. The Korean NIS," he considered. "Days. They've been building a parallel case against the BIEC network for 18 months. Your files are the connective tissue they were missing." A pause. "Adongo is more complicated. Kenya's EACC moves slowly, and he has political protection. But the Interpol connection changes his exposure internationally. He can't travel. He can't access the network. He's contained." "Contained isn't justice," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's the beginning of it." He looked at her. "It's enough for tonight." She leaned her head back against the seat, exhaled, long, slow, the breath of someone setting down something they had been carrying for 2 years through every continent their grief took them to. "It's enough for tonight," she repeated softly. The penthouse was quiet. Ji Young had left a pot of something on the counter, covered, warm, the kind of thoughtfulness that arrived without announcement. The rain was gone. The city outside was clear and cold and glittering, Seoul post-storm, every surface washed clean and reflective. Nia stood at the kitchen counter, still in the red dress, shoes off, her grandmother's chain catching the light, and ate whatever Ji Young had left standing up because she was too tired to find a chair and too alive, too electric, too full of the evening, to sit still anyway. Minjun appeared in the kitchen doorway, jacket off, collar open, the tattoo at his throat visible, the living are only passing through, and looking, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who was genuinely, quietly exhaling. He looked at her eating standing up at his counter in a red dress at midnight. "There's a table," he said. "I know," she said. He almost smiled. She caught the whole thing this time. It went further than it usually allowed itself, a real smile, brief, devastating. He got his own bowl, stood beside her at the counter. They ate in the specific comfortable silence of people who have been through something together and don't need to perform recovery from it. "What happens now?" she said. Not to the question of the investigation, to something smaller and larger than that simultaneously. He was quiet for a moment. "Your fellowship ends in 10 days, he said. "Yes. Your flight to Nairobi, yes." He put his bowl down, turned slightly so he was facing her. Not fully, not dramatically, just the degree of turn that meant, "I'm saying something real now, and I want you to know it's real." "I'm not going to ask you to stay," he said. She looked at him, words with that characteristic precision. The man who had learned that the wrong sentence was irreversible. "You have a life that matters, work that the world needs, a city that is yours." His eyes held hers, I'm not going to be the thing that pulls you out of it. Minjun, let me finish. Not harsh. Quiet. The quiet of someone saying something that costs them and paying the cost without flinching. I have spent 11 years building something in this city. An empire I justified with my brother's name and my father's death and every wrong thing that was ever done to the people I loved. He looked at his hands, the bandaged knuckle, the hands that had done the things they'd done. Meeting you has not made me a different man. I want to be honest with you about that. I am still what I am. He looked up. But you have made me want to be worth something to a world that exists outside of this one. And that. His voice didn't change, but something underneath it did. Tectonic and deep. That is not a small thing, that is possibly the largest thing that has happened to me since I was 22 years old. The kitchen was very still. Nia set her own bowl down. She turned to face him fully. You think I don't know who you are? She said quietly. You think I walked through 11 days of this? The penthouse and the summit, and Ha-Yoon and Adongo and that room tonight, without seeing you clearly? He said nothing. I photograph things, Minjun. She took one step toward him. It's what I do. I look at something until I see what it actually is, not what it presents, not what it wants me to see. Another step. I see you. His jaw moved. What do you see? He asked. She reached up. Her fingers traced the column of characters at his throat. The living are only passing through, so lightly she could barely feel the warmth of his skin. A man who decided to love something bigger than his pain, she said, and never told anyone. Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically, not loudly, the way things break open when they've been held too long and someone finally, carefully, puts their hands on either side of the fracture and says it's all right to let go now. He pulled her in. Not the summit kiss. Not that. Not the declaration in front of 80 people in a criminal empire. This was different. His arms around her, her face against his shoulder, his chin at her temple. Holding, just holding, the way people hold each other when the words have run out and the body has to finish the sentence. She held him back, and luminous. Inside, something that had started with a desperate whisper in a ballroom in Gangnam had arrived. Fully, finally, at whatever it had always been trying to become. She found him on the terrace at sunrise. Same place as the first morning, same railing, same city going gold beneath him, but different. Everything the same and completely different, the way a room looks different when you've changed. She stood beside him, close, not the careful 3 feet of the first morning. He made space for her at the railing, a small shift, natural, unconscious, and she understood that he had already started doing the thing people do when someone has become part of their physical landscape, making room without thinking about it, adjusting without deciding to. They watched Seoul wake up. I'm going to need to go back, she said. I know. The investigation will need me, testimony, documentation, the EACC will want to depose me, and Interpol will want the originals. She paused. And I have work. The fellowship exhibition runs another 3 weeks. I have a life there. I know, he said again. Not sad, not desperate. The way he said everything, with the full, clear-eyed acceptance of a man who had decided to want something real, even when real was complicated. She looked at him sideways. I'm also going to need to come back, she said. He turned. His eyes found hers. The Bake network isn't fully dismantled, she said, keeping her voice even, watching something warm and devastating move through his expression. There are trafficking routes I haven't fully documented. 3 syndicates still operating between Mombasa and Busan, and, she paused. Someone has to make sure the Iron Veil's anonymous conservation funding gets to the right places. That requires oversight. Regular oversight. His mouth curved. The full smile again, rare and real and worth every day of earning it. Regular oversight, he repeated. Very thorough, she said. I take my work seriously. He reached out and tucked a loose curl behind her ear, the gesture of a man who had decided and was done undeciding. Uji, he said. She blinked, then laughed, genuine, surprised, the laugh of someone who hadn't expected to be delighted. Your pronunciation is terrible. Nina Hitaji Ukweli, he said, worse. That was criminal, she said. David would have been offended on behalf of the language. Teach me, he said. I have time. She looked at him. This man, this empire, this collection of silences and succulents and anonymous wire transfers, and a brother named Seo Jun who drew floor plans on napkins because he couldn't stop thinking about light. Nina Kupenda, she said softly. He waited. It means... I know what it means, he said quietly. She stared at him. You looked it up, she breathed. I had time, he said. Last night, while you were sleeping, the sunrise was doing something extraordinary over Seoul. Gold bleeding into pink, bleeding into the particular blue of a city deciding to begin again. She leaned up. He met her halfway. 3 weeks later, Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, Nairobi. She came through arrivals with her camera bag and her grandmother's gold chain, and the bracelet she hadn't taken off since he fastened it in a penthouse above a lit city. And the first thing she did was stop in the middle of the terminal and turn her face up to the Nairobi air, warm and red-earthed and real, and breathe. Home. Her phone buzzed. One message. No greeting, no preamble. A photograph. The succulent on his windowsill. A new leaf, small, improbable, reaching. And underneath it, in the handwriting that was precise and architectural and suggested someone who had been taught to write with absolute intention. It grew. She smiled so wide that a stranger walking past looked at her and smiled too, not knowing why, just catching it the way you catch something warm. She typed back one word. Good. Then she walked out into Nairobi and got to work. But in a penthouse in Seoul, a man who had built an empire on the premise that the living were only passing through sat at his desk and looked at a corkboard covered in conservation maps and wire transfer routes and one new photograph. A woman in a gold Ankara dress laughing at something off camera. Taken the night, everything changed. And for the first time in 11 years, made a plan that had nothing to do with survival. He had a call to make. 3 trafficking routes. 2 corrupt officials. 1 international investigation that needed Iron Veil intelligence to move at the speed justice required, and a woman in Nairobi who had said she was coming back. He intended to make sure the world was worth coming back to. He picked up the phone.